Hello, everyone. This is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. If this is your first time here, this is a podcast about political commentary, a sprinkling of philosophy, organizing psychology, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4AS, and this is my co-host, Mr. A. So, Mr. A, how are you going today?
I am very well, 4IS. How are you, sir?
I am doing pretty well, Mr. A. And of course, we have our other co-host, Kareem, the Dream, our resident AI explorer. How are you going today, mate?
Good. Explorer, not expert.
Not this time.
Explorer.
Not this time. See, I got it right this time.
Still in education mode. Still looking forward to hearing all about the means of production.
Of course.
And still preparing myself to bombard you with some silly questions.
Yes, of course.
So you have to walk me through it like a child on this one, yeah?
No. That's completely fine. I will make sure in my prompt to you, Kareem, to make sure that I explain it as if I'm talking to a 6-year-old. Okay,
It's a good prompt. It's a good prompt. It helps.
But jokes aside,
You can explain it.
But jokes aside, Kareem did prompt us on what the discussion for today is you wanted to do a devil's advocate episode, Kareem, about the means of production, because you weren't too sure what that actually meant.
Yeah. So how it kind of came about was I don't know. I must have had this like intuitive reaction to the word "seize the means of production." I'm like, you sure there isn't another way? I'm like, hang on, I don't even know what the means of production is, so clearly I'm missing something here.
Okay. Okay, would you like me to start with the definition then?
Please.
Okay, yeah, sure. So good old Google and I guess the internet was able to tell me the means of production refers to the resources and tools necessary for creating goods and services. This includes everything from land, labor, and capital to machinery, raw materials, and other infrastructure required for productions. Now,
So are we happy, 4IS, to have capitalist pigs define means of production for us Marxists? Is that right? Are we happy with it?
Well, see, that's the thing. You preempted me, Mr. A, because that's probably not how a Marxist would interpret it, because they would probably focus on capital. And at least the tidbit I would add is that, well, really what's important here, I guess much like what the means of production is also really important to, is that it's the oil for the machine of a certain society, and then that's the mechanism that basically creates power. So let's go back. Well, yeah, let's actually use David Graeber, because I just finished the Debt the First 5,000 Years. What he would consider means of production using it in this framework is that, okay, go back to the Axle Age. And, he goes in the book about how we have this cyclical nature of, we have coinage, then virtual money, coinage, and virtual money. If we go back to the Axle Age, so where he starts 5,000 years ago, in Mesopotamia and, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and all of that, is that the means of production for there was slavery. Because really what these powers did was they went out, they conquered other lands. Imagine yourself as a Roman senator, you conquer other lands, you bring back those goals or whoever you had conquered. And those slaves were important for all the materials that you created, or like everything to make your society function. And, they went through quite a lot of slaves, whether they were working in the mines or creating their materials at home or on their lavish land. And then,
so like quite specifically though, because like means of production, you can obviously break into a number of subcategories. And so like what you're referring to in terms of like slaves and stuff like that under the productive forces is the labor power, is the slaves. So like the means of production are kind of the things that the people, whoever are making the value in that society, are using as part of their production. So if these slaves are using tools, like hand tools, to plow a field or something like that, to, I don't know, harvest the grain that feeds the society and goes into the mills that make the bread that all the ancient folk eat and survive off. Those elements that like the slaves would be using and like the bakers would be using to cook and all that sort of stuff. Those things are the means of production, including the buildings, including the fields. So you described before land, labor, and capital. So like all of that comes into the means of production. Anything I think that really is important to the production process, producing anything around you in a society, is part of the means of production. And the humans who get to toil away with those means of production, that's the labor power that's thrown into the mix with the means of production. So,
no, that's a fair point, because really with Axel Age, yes, it was the slaves and what they use, which were important to the means of production. Because if you then go on to feudal societies with serfs and lords, the thing that was important in terms of the means of production was, agrarian land. Like, who was able to create their power in order to establish the power over land was who controlled the means of production. And then, of course, you move even more forward between society, you then go into the Industrial Revolution and all of that. And then the means of production was capital, as, Das Kapital and Karl Marx go into quite heavily, where commodities turn into money, into more commodities, and the way that that machine is oiled is through how you're able to reproduce your capital. And well, I wouldn't exactly say that's exactly where we are now, because then you have to go on to FDR and then the rise of the social welfare state, and then you move on to probably our modern encapsulation of late stage capitalism, where it's about convincing the population to buy a piece of capital in order to survive. So, a classic case, going quite a few episodes back when we were talking about the housing crisis, what's important is for people to buy into getting themselves fixed capital, which is housing, in order to survive. So to get their nest egg in order for you to have a comfortable existence. Yeah, like all of that stuff, even though it's a very broad stroke view of it, that's all means of production.
Can I, sorry, just pull up, because I'm starting to get a little bit confused now, like between means of production and capital, because like my initial impression, like when I heard it, was that capital was money, basically. Right. Now it sounds like the definition, like I've heard the definition sort of, I could be getting this wrong, getting used in say accounting terms as being like capital machinery. But you also mentioned capital potentially referring to land as well, and a piece of capital to sustain yourself. Now, in the original definition we gave of means of production, we also included land, labor, and capital. So it's starting to sound like those terms are getting used interchangeably, like means of production and capital. Is there any sort of is one a subset of the other? Is there,
I would say so.
Variation between the two, or like
and like capital is unique. If you're looking at capitalism, capital is kind of unique to that mode of production. So we live in a capitalistic society, and so capital in a capitalistic society is a very specific force of its own. So it's like a force. Think of it more of a force than a thing. But like capital has existed throughout the ages. Wherever people have had commerce, you could say there's been capital, because people might invest in something and they call it capital, or they might buy a bunch of commodities from one person and then try and sell it to another party, and they'll make a bit of money on top of that, and they'll call that capital. But that's different. And economists will refer to that as capital. But like when you're looking at a mode of production, capital is something different altogether. So let me just give you some very basic terms so you can kind of, and so like the listeners can kind of understand this, unless they're well-versed Marxists, because we're going to be using a Marxist way of looking at this, not an economist's way of looking at this. So that's a really important distinction off the bat, because, you know, capital is a very interchangeable word, and we will be using it, me and 4AS, in a very, very specific way. Okay, so means of production, as we were describing before, are like anything that helps you produce. So when we were hunters and gatherers, if you had a bow, you picked up a stone and you used that to like break open a nut, those are your means of production. All right, and like in a hunter-gatherer society, means of production were very egalitarian. Anyone could have picked up that rock. Anyone could, like if they had the knowledge, make a bow for themselves. Anyone that knew how to weave could make a basket or a net and go fishing. So the means of production were owned by everyone. And so there was no power, like there was, but there was no institutionalized power structure in those hunter-gatherer societies. They were rather egalitarian from a Marxian perspective, because like anyone could make their own net and go fishing. No one owned that.
But I'm probably interjecting a bit early here, but
no, please.
I guess if you make your own net or you make your own bow and arrow, then theoretically, like that's your bow and arrow. Like it's you need the knowledge, and the knowledge is egalitarian. You can ask to what you want to teach it to you, and whether or not they want to teach it to you is entirely up to them. So it may not necessarily even be egalitarian knowledge, but theoretically, like your personal means of production, like. I imagine that you like don't steal my boat. It's like I'll lend it to you if I want, but it's coming back to me at the end. For the stone in the middle of the like the concept of ownership over the means of production. I'm just theorizing might have existed as far back as even then. Like,
yes, and there would have been personal property, but not what we refer to as private property. So private property is actually, in again the Marxian sense. Private property relations is like owning the means of production. It's not personal stuff. So like if I had a sacred necklace that my grandmother gave to me and her mother gave to her and so on and so forth, that's usually what we would associate with personal property. But like if we're living in a commune, like a communistic kind of society, a hunter-gatherer one, it is highly likely, and this is based on anthropological kind of studies as well, it's highly likely that like those people would have gone hunting together or weaved baskets together or foraged for, you know, berries or something together in groupings. And it's highly unlikely, unless there was some spiritual significance or, like I said, intergenerational significance to something, that like you would, you know, not allow your friend or your brother or someone like that to use the net that you were using to help you catch fish because it was going to benefit the community anyway. So like, while I understand what you're saying, some people might have taken personal claim to certain things, quite generally the means of production were shared by all.
Okay.
And so that is like a hallmark of like hunter-gatherer societies, which Marxians will refer to as primitive communism, which you might find interesting because we throw the word communism around. And so like it's primitive in the sense that it's not a society with developed means of production, like technological means of production, like an industrial society. Sorry, 4 hours.
No, all I was going to add, though, is probably more to the sentiment you were saying before, Kareem, where you're like, oh, well, it seems like you're kind of using all of these terms interchangeably, whether it's Marxists or economists and that sort of thing. You have to take into consideration that the reason why you feel like it's interchangeable is because we are in the capitalist means of production or mode of production. So, like, you, as far as you're concerned, because you know, capital is the thing that makes the world go round, makes the thing that oils the machine that we are living in nowadays. As far as people are concerned, the only way you get your building and machinery and being able to make a dollar or a dime is because of capital, because capital is the thing that makes businesses work now. So because of that bias, it's as far as capital is concerned, as well as property rights is concerned, That's the thing that makes it go round. So we're kind of coming from that bias.
So a mode of production is like, in this sense, like I said, for hunter-gatherers, it was like a Marxist would call it a primitive communist society, because like I said, because like these types of things you could make yourself if you really wanted to. And no one really like laid claim over it as like a ruling class, let's say, above everybody else. Then it's like communistic. It's a very egalitarian society, because anyone could like own these means of production, these ways of producing value. So like the food that you eat, the shelter that you make for yourself, the clothes that you wear to shelter you from the elements, all of these basic necessities that you need for your survival, the way that they are produced is owned by everyone. So it's communistic because it's the means of production are owned by everyone. So like when you get to a slave society, usually like, you know, an ancient society or something like that, when people start to become a little bit more complex in their social organization.
Can I step it before, like just a step before that?
Yeah.
Like let's say like the invention of agriculture.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Or like husbandry, animal husbandry. Like when we started raising animals, who owned the animals? Like was it still did we still have like a primitive from communism on that, or like how did that work? Like,
well, it probably would have potentially started in a more primitive communistic style, but like once you start, let's say, clearing land for use in agriculture, and you start putting up like boundaries on things, and like you start grazing certain areas for your flock to the exclusion of all others, you start to seek privatization of land, let's say, and space for the cultivation of your crops, for the grazing of your animals. And once you start to put up fences or boundaries on things where before you could have kind of gone anywhere, let's say, you start to have social relations that meet those needs. And so those social relations are, well, I lay claim to this area, and like I will need people to protect that for me. So there'll be a class of individuals who protect the land. There'll be a class of individuals that work the land, and there'll be a class of individuals that kind of make the tools that the people that farm on the land need to farm properly. And then the soldiers need weapons. I'll get some people to make those tools for them and their armor and all that sort of stuff. And so for the first time, you start to have, this is an important concept, but like a division of labor.
Specialization.
Okay, so the specialization. And once you have people specializing in things, the person that makes the tools over there needs the farmer over there to be successful. Because if this farmer over there isn't successful, then my soldiers and my people working in my industry, they die. And I need those. But then if the people in the industry don't make the tools for the other two, they're fucking useless to me now as well. So once you have a division of labor, then you have potentially a managerial class or a group of people that are ruling over the top of them, kind of, all right, this is all my stuff, and you get to work on it, and you can have some of the food, and you work for me and protect it all, and you can have some of the food, and you over there, you make all the stuff, and you can have some of the food too.
So you don't think it's possible to have an interdependency without that sort of that leadership, like, or like that rule?
And that's why I said before, it wouldn't have started. It wouldn't have just been like, all right, we've got agriculture now, you know, like let's just like live in a stratified society. Like there would have been a transitional period towards this. And as like people laid claim to kind of more and more area, and like, cause not all area is fertile. If you look at the way that like civilizations kind of erupted in the ancient era, it was on like plains that are close to rivers, like delta areas that had natural irrigation. So you can only have agriculture that can basically service a large population of people if the ground is fertile and is easily watered. So like this isn't going to happen in the middle of the desert and this isn't going to happen in like an arid region. This is going to happen in very particular climates around the world. And so you have stuff in the Indus Valley, you have stuff in Mesopotamia, you have stuff going on in the Nile River. Around these areas, this is where civilization started to kind of take form for the first time in the concentration that we're talking about. So as people start to cultivate and they can make they can use their means of production. So the land, in this case, like fertile soil that's easily irrigated. So that starts to become means of production. And like they have different tools now. They have axes that they've developed, and so they can clear land and chop trees down and clear greater and greater territories. They can start to create more food with the same amount of work or less work, and they can service more and more people. And that's how civilizations start to develop. And like, as you have more and more of a division of labor, you generally have some people, and this is just a generalization, but if you look at the history of these civilizations that we're talking about, they were hierarchical. And you had a ruling class of people that kind of, managed the realm and managed all of the divisions of labor underneath them.
It sounds like you're against the division of labor.
Well, I am not actually. What I'm actually against is a class system that somehow benefits off the division of labor. The division of labor is not a problem. Like, we can't actually survive in an industrial society without the most complex array of division of labor that the human race has ever seen.
See, I might be going on a bit of a tangent here, but one of my core sort of philosophies is that, actually, we would have talked about this on a previous podcast, apocalyptic skill set.
Yeah.
What do I actually bring to the table if the world goes to shit? Like,
yes.
what can I do? Can I feed myself? Can I, can I build a tent? Can I, But, like, I feel like there's a basic sort of skill set that, like, everybody needs, like all humans would benefit from having. But over and above that, we're trying to develop sort of individual capabilities. We're pursuing, a breadth of additional capabilities. We're pursuing mastery in certain domains. Where,
But this is the beauty of a complex society. Like, we live in an advanced, complex, industrial society. And it's like, really, what we're talking about here is not needing 60% of your population to work the land to feed people so you can have, like, other people do stuff like art or like fine craftsmanship and artisanry and all that sort of stuff. We don't need 60% of the population to be working to feed us anymore. We could literally have like 10% of the population now. Like in America, like at the turn of the century, so like the turn of the century between the 19th and the 20th century, there was like, I think it was like 50 or more % of people lived like working in farms and stuff like that. Now, like in America, there's like less than 20% of the population that live and work in agriculture, feeding America. So like, like their society has completely changed. And like, that's because of the development of industrial society. And I would argue there's probably less than that. Again, it's just like some people choose to kind of work the land because they enjoy that type of thing. It's actually like a choice now as opposed to a necessity. And so like in an advanced industrial nation, you can have, let's say 10% of the population working to feed us, which everyone needs food. And like you can have 90% of the population doing other things, like you were saying, like being really, really hyper specialized, so specialized that if, we lost electricity or power one day and that happened for a long enough period, most people would probably die because they wouldn't be able to sustain themselves anymore. But like such is the risk of living in such a society with such a, I guess, a hyper division of labor as we're describing. Like, so back in these ancient civilizations, division of labor was, I guess, much less than it is now. And in a communistic society, a primitive communistic society, such a small division of labor that potentially most people will be able to do most things. Like they'd be able to make the nets and make the bows and like the shelters and the huts that they lived in and all that sort of stuff, the clothes that they wore and stuff like that. They do it all themselves. And so like as you start to divide, you start to compartmentalize sections of society, and then you have different interest groups. When you have different interest groups, then you have the ability for some to, I guess, lay claim over others. And like there's nothing wrong with that. Like in a sense, like sometimes you have to manage society through hierarchies. You need like hierarchies to help, systems work. But like the anarchist in me says, as long as the hierarchy is justifiable, then it is fine. Because like sometimes you need a hierarchy to be efficient. But as soon as the hierarchy just becomes institutionalized and exists because it's a hierarchy as opposed to it serving its actual purpose, then you have to question, why do I need that hierarchy anymore. That's a very anarchist point, I'd say.
And probably to kind of go back to your original sentiment as well, Kareem, when you were like, oh, well, do you not like division of labor, or are you questioning the division of labor? And then Mr. A was like, oh, well, no, it's more questioning class rather than questioning division of labor. Take an ordinary company. I know this is a point that I've made 1,000 times in this podcast, but it's relevant right now. You have an ordinary company. This has happened many, many times throughout history, or at least in the capitalist mode of production. You have a owner of a business that all of a sudden the business is not profitable anymore, and he's going to sell it off. And then the workers turn around and they say, well, if you don't want to run it, we'll run it. And the co-op of that business is formed. And, you know, there's no problem with there being division of labor, of, you know, who's good marketers, who's good
fair call.
work. Sorry?
Fair call.
Yeah. And like who's good on the shop floor. And the only difference between both sets of way of structuring that business is that the ladder, the co-op, is that 4 days a week you do your job the way it's been divided, and then on the Friday you all meet together and you decide to work out what you're going to do for the business. And you know that at least is a much more egalitarian framework of how to structure a business.
Talk to me more about how that intersects with the means of production, though. Like, I mean, is the goal sort of to put the means of production in the hands of the workers, or like?
Well, like if we're talking about seizing the means, like I guess the long shot of what I was trying to get at before was means of production are exactly as the name suggests. They are any means of producing value in society. And so like society needs a minimum amount of value to survive, like subsist. And then like society has kind of like an expectation or a standard of where the value production should be, so we can all live at a decent living standard. And so like somewhere between like absolute bare necessity and like acceptable living standard is where we expect our production to be at. And so everybody gets involved in the production process at some point, or like reinforces the production process. So like lawyers, they don't produce anything, but they're necessary to run a business apparently. So, you know, here we go. And like accountants, like who the hell cares about accountants? Like honestly, but like, you know, they're there.
Yeah, I don't care about accountants.
But they're there supporting the system and holding it up. Like, you know, because that's how our society is structured at the moment. But like, anyway, there's value that is produced to a certain extent that society needs to reproduce itself and basically exist. Now, all of those things, like the land, the buildings, the technology, tools, whatever have you, like resources, so like coal and lumber, like everything that goes into that system to help produce value, certain societies have different ways of ownership over that. And so we were talking before about hierarchical societies. And it's usually, this is a very Marxian view of history, but they who own the means of production own society. And so in a capitalist society, the capitalist class owns the means of production. They own the factories. They own the businesses. They own the property. They own the technology. They own the land, the resources. They own, like indirectly, we will say in this conversation, the working class. And so like in the feudal times, there wasn't indirectly, they overtly owned the working class, so but like they owned the land, they owned the manor and the land that the serfs were tied to, kind of thing. And so they owned the means of production, and they owned the tools and stuff like that the peasants worked with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so like in an ancient society, the masters owned the slaves, and like the slaves were, you know, slaves weren't just owned by like rich people, like everybody had slaves, like plebs had slaves. If you could afford one, you had at least one or two in your house helping you reproduce yourself as a family unit. And so you had some slaves doing your odd jobs so you could participate as a citizen. So a lot of Greeks who were, in the democratic phase of Greek civilization in the ancient times, they probably would have had some slaves at home so they could go out and do their responsibilities as a citizen in that society. So they lent on the slaves being there to be able to create value for them so they could continue to, reproduce their society. So it's to bring it back to the hierarchy, whoever owns the means of production, the way of producing that value, is the people that rule that dominion and rule over that epoch in history. And to answer another question that you kind of had before about private property, in a bourgeois society, so a capitalist society, we have private property rights. So private property really is actually about who owns the businesses, who owns the corporations. And these businesses and corporations are the things that own factories. They own large-scale industrial agricultural premises. They make all the food that everybody lives off. They are the tech bros who own all the artificial intelligence that is now going in to all of the businesses out there that want to have, easy customer service relations and want to fire most of the humans that do that job because they can have chatbots that do it for them. And so these people that own these technologies that help us by extension produce all the value out there, these are the people that generally own society or control society. For us it's very indirect, let's say, but the means of production are incredibly important. Who controls the stuff that makes the value.
All right. Do you mind if I just throw this out there in terms of testing an idea? So I imagine in today's day and age, and with the development of knowledge economies and development of proliferation of professional services and the global nature of some of those services and the ability to participate as say a sole trader or an individual in those economies and offer your services professionally, that might not necessarily be tied to anything physical. That might strictly be a function of your capabilities or a demonstration of your education or how you've sort of developed your own skill set. In that situation, theoretically, I would still have an opportunity to participate in the economy, to create value of some sort that I can market to other people. But there isn't really the only capital involved in that is me, really. Because it's not maybe I use a keyboard or a computer or something else for that. How does that sort of tie into ownership of the means of production? Granted, I might not make it as far as someone who has capital, who's got a marketing budget, who's got whatever other advantages they've got, that might be a function of privilege or whatever. But I guess even in terms of education, not everybody gets the same level of education or access to education. I can appreciate it on that level. But at the very minimum, I suppose, as an individual, I've still got an opportunity to theoretically own my own means of production and participate in the economy. Is that how does that tie in with ownership of means of production, or the need to seize them?
If you're talking about in your own kind of in this very micro situation as opposed to a macro situation, so you said that you use a keyboard and you're like a freelancer or something like that. You have a keyboard, a mouse, and a laptop. Or a desktop computer, and that's how you etch a living.
I'm a social media influencer.
You got a phone, and you're a social media influencer. Your means of production is your phone. But the value you produce is you said you referred to yourself as the capital there, which is like a term that is used a bit in bourgeois economics about human capital and stuff like that. So yes, you're selling yourself kind of as the product, you're the commodity, and but like your only way to deliver that to the market is your means of production in that case, which is through your phone. And so like, yes, there is obviously an argument there that you're producing value yourself and you're contributing to the economy somehow, right? On your own, like, individual level. But like, this is why I took it back right to the beginning of, you know, the dawn of civilization kind of thing, and like pre-dawn of civilization. So like, you know, hunter-gatherer societies. Society as a macro organism reproduces itself by producing the value that everybody survives off. And so like, as I gave that example before, like America 100 years ago, most people were involved in producing the value that everyone survived off. But now in society, we've got like such a small segment of the population that's involved with that. It's actually a hallmark or a signature of how wonderful capitalist society is. Yes, believe it. You hear me saying how wonderful capitalist society is, that we have so few people now required in an advanced industrial nation to, you know, give their labor power over to have to be employed in producing food, producing clothes, producing your keyboard, your mouse, and your phone or your desktop. We have so few people in advanced industrial societies now needing to give themselves over to produce that value, so you can be a freelancer. So you can decide to, you know, produce your own value. And like, you can still get like money for that. You can still get paid for that, because that's how society is structured. Like, that it's not necessary that every member of society has to go and work in the fields anymore. Like, we have technology that does that for us. And that's the beauty of this style of society. But like, let me put it to you like this, okay? Let's just say, like, you know, 90% of the agricultural land in Australia, and like Australia is, you know, basically geared towards, you know, food production and stuff like that. It was how we were colonized, and resource production. That is our value that we offer not only to ourselves in Australia, but we offer to the global economy. We produce like iron ore, and we produce coal and like gas, and we produce like produce. Like, we've got, like, we send meat out across the world, and like agricultural goods and all that sort of stuff. That's the value we produce. And like, the nation's wealth is built a lot on that. Like, our GDP, like, for the most part, comes from like the value that is produced by our agricultural sectors, our mining sectors, our resources. So there is still value there. But like, what the phenomenon that we feel here in an advanced capitalist or industrial nation is that, like, most people aren't really involved in that type of value production. So we don't really think of it as like a big deal anymore, because we've got this amazing technology. And so like, a lot of people can do, like, look at me. Like, I spend my time, you know, on the internet, and like, you know, streaming and like producing videos and stuff. I'm not adding value to society, like, you know, in that traditional Marxian kind of sense.
Sure.
You know what I mean? I might be adding value to other people, but I'm not, you know, I'm enriching people's lives. Don't get me wrong. But like, I'm not like, you know, in that traditional, like, materialist assessment. I'm not, you know, I don't own the means of production, and I'm not adding that style of value. It's a very specific form of value that I'm talking about. Now let me just finish it off with this. There is still people producing the value, the food that we eat, the resources that we need to make our phones and our desktop computers and our keyboards and all that sort of stuff. That value is being produced by someone, and it's being produced under private property relations in the interest of private interests for profit. And so like, if we have such sophisticated technology now where you don't need that many people to run it anyway, then like, let's seize those things, own it as a society, as a global community of people, because the technology is there. Let's just let those means of production create the value, and we all own it, and we all get to decide what type of phone we make, what type of keyboard we make, what type of food we make, what type of clothes we make, all that sort of stuff. Let's do that not in private interest, but as a collective. I'll leave that with you. It sees those means.
Though, just to kind of go back to your question, Kareem, the other aspect, I guess, what I kind of started this conversation with, which I'm very glad that Mr. E brought it back to, means of production is what produces value. But like to go back to the PowerPoint that I was kind of making, hey, you have the professional services person, you have person A and person B. Like, let's take into consideration a really famous term that everyone seems to throw around nowadays as well. It's like, it's not really about what you know, it's also about who you know. And like, really, with that sort of thing, let's go back to what I was saying before. We don't have a system of one vote, one person, one vote. We have a system of $1, one vote. And the fact of the matter is, like, in a world, especially say in America, where you have you have somebody from a poor background that needs to try so hard with their grades and their SATs and all of that just to get a scholarship. And then you have some rich kid's son or daughter who is at a legacy admission and then just walks up to Harvard or Cambridge and it's like, hey, yeah, my parents went here in the 80s. Can you let me in? And they're like, oh yeah, sure, let's do that. And like, because you know who you know, because, like, let's face it, the reason why that legacy admission happened in the first place is because, I don't know, say they were a pinhead mogul back in the day, like they owned a massive firm that did pinheads. That means of production has translated into power later. And now, even though we believe in meritocracies or, the American dream where all you have to do is pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that's, power kind of uses those means of production to produce different results. Definitely, whether you're poor compared to whether you're rich. So, yeah, like, it may seem like it's skills versus skills, but sometimes it's money versus skills.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, no, I can appreciate what you're saying. I guess I'm still fixated on this need to seize the means of production. Like, I don't know why I've got an intuitive resistance to the idea that I don't know. It's entirely possible I'm sold on the American dream. like I'll just own it up front. I'm living the lie over here. That it is possible to create my own means of production. Now I recognize that what you guys are saying is that if the traditional sort of way that we look at means of production, even in the capitalist way of looking at means of production, if we adopt that mentality, then inherently that's going to lead to hierarchies, inherently that's going to lead to power imbalances, inherently that's going to lead to inequality. Like, I can appreciate all of that. Is the solution to seize the means of production? I'm still not sold on that as being the only solution. I guess that's where my resistance to the idea is coming from. Like, I'm still not sold on the idea that there's absolutely no other way for me to create my own means of production. Like,
no, that's fine. Would it help if I did a quote that I got before we started today,
sure,
and then go into a story? Hopefully it helps your situation, but this is actually from the book that I just finished reading, which is Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. And it might speak to what you kind of were referring to before, or at least your reservations about seizing the means of production. So he says, in fact, it could well be said that the last 30 years have seen the construction of a vast bureaucratic apparatus for the creation and maintenance of hopelessness, a giant machine designed first and foremost to destroy any sense of positive alternatives futures. At its root is a veritable obsession on the part of the rulers of the world, in response to the upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s, with ensuring that social movements cannot be seen to grow, flourish, or propose alternatives. That those who challenge existing power arrangements can never, under any circumstances, be perceived to win. To do so requires creating a vast apparatus of armies, prisons, police, various forms of private security firms, and military intelligence apparatus, and propaganda engines of every conceivable variety, most of which do not attack alternatives directly, so much as create a pervasive climate of fear, jingoistic conformity, and simple despair that renders any thought of changing the world seem as idle fantasy. And with that, let me go into the story. And this is actually...
I'm dying to hear this story.
Yeah. And this is actually a previous stream of yours, Mystery. The Melbourne protest against the Merchants of Death. And...
great time.
Yeah. So, yeah. So this is technically a stream that Mystery did ages ago. And it was like... was it October last year that this happened? I'm pretty sure it was. But in Melbourne, so I think it was like the Melbourne Convention Centre, basically a bunch of weapons manufacturers. And quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if they were peddling weapons and warheads that would have that's probably ended up with not real. Is that what you're calling the conflict of the outside?
Is not real.
Is not real.
Yeah.
That was shipped off to not real. And there were a bunch of protesters that were behind the fences and basically yelling at the Merchants of Deaths, aka the arms manufacturers, because they were protesting them, shipping arms off to wars and killing people unnecessary. And obviously you saw pictures from the media about them being angry, and I think there was even quotes from like the local politicians being like, oh, those protesters, they're being rowdy and rabble rousers, and look, they've been causing all sorts of problems to the police. Yeah. But then when you actually cut to the footage they have, because you hear all of this stuff, your primes, and you're like, oh, they must have wrecked buildings, they must have done all of this stuff, and like you just see images of people like yelling and then just like them throwing their fists off, and then like the police come out of nowhere and like spray them with pepper spray and like are shoving them all over the place. I think like maybe there was one person that pushed back at police, and like they were just being there protesting something. Like in no way, shape, or form were like were they really doing anything wrong. It's just that they were on private property of the Melbourne Convention Centre, and the police were just there to move them on. And again, that goes back to that quote I said before, because it's really about, who owns the means of production, and in this case, the reinforcing message of, who owns private property, and therefore the apparatus that surrounds it of who owns the means of violence in order to instill the means of production and the power of that society. So when you have reservations about, hey, seizing this thing, like, sure, I'm not telling you to go out and just kill a random person, but what I am encouraging you to do is to defend yourself. And the police are not the police or the private security person that is guarding that is going to use that means of violence in order to reinstate that private property. But I think you should be well within your means in order to defend yourself.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying in terms of like violence being linked to the means of production. So like potentially the reality that violence might be used in the acquisition, or like I understand where it's coming from in terms of that perspective, and the reality around propaganda with the media, that you're describing with the protest. I guess let me paint a slightly different picture, because this I'll take us back to discussion that we were having on a previous podcast around the network state, and how the tech bros have acquired power, and potentially more power than what we would consider the traditional means of production, like ownership over land, ownership over like food supply, or like things that prior to sort of these developments in technology, were concentrated in the hands of a few, and protected vigorously and protected with violence. So, but sort of the direction that I see society headed in. This is me just playing devil's advocate here. I'm just testing out ideas. So that if it were possible, like say with the rise of AI, with the development of these additional technologies, for the tech bros to even acquire power, so then the power dynamic that was attached to the traditional means of production, and its relationship with the land and its relationship with labor, is changing. So in terms of needing to seize the means of production, as opposed to finding a different way to acquire power within the system, now potentially we wind up in the same situation where whoever has acquired power, and we were talking about this in the network state, like, the tech bros being like, there's Greenland for sale, let's go live in Greenland. And then someone in just swooping and taking the whole lot of it. like we did have that discussion, so I'm not blind to it. But at the same time, like it just feels like because the power dynamic is changing from within the system, then the necessity of seizing the means of production doesn't feel as urgent, because we found a different way to change the power dynamic. And if the power dynamic is sort of what was wrong with the owners of the means of production, leading to inequality, leading to hierarchies, leading to, potentially we got different problems down the track in terms of a new type of meritocracy, a new type of hierarchy, a new type of inequality that develops. I'm not blind to those issues either, but at least we found a way to get there from within the system. And I'm not against changing the system either. I've been using the AI systems to redesign the system. I've gone into a lot of detail with this. So, but
can I just clarify then for you? This might be of assistance, I think, at this stage of the conversation, that the consequence of the development of human civilization has meant that those who own the means of production are generally the ruling class. And so that is like a causality kind of situation there. I don't think that is like written in stone, but like if you look at human history, those people that have kind of controlled that stuff, so the capitalist class has controlled the things that produce all the value that everyone lives off, and so they generally run society. They are like generally the people that have the money to buy the politicians and change, like rewrite the laws and make the policy decisions go in their interests and all that sort of stuff. And so like, while it's not everything that happens in that system. You can have a lot of popular, uprisings and people getting together and voting and using their power as a collective and voting in their own interests. And then they can get policies and legislation changed in their own interests. But generally, the people that own the means of production have the resources to control the system. So like it would be way more overt in like, the ancient times where you had like an emperor or someone. They had extreme and like absolute control. In like feudal times, you had a king that basically had the divine right of king. So they pretty much had control over everything, and the church did too. And now like as a class, which is not a unified class, might I add, the capitalist class kind of has the means, because of the control that they have over the means of production, to kind of make society run in their interests. Now, what we're talking about here is not hierarchy when it comes to owning the means of production. What we're talking about is why people control the means of production in this society. And like, let's say a food manufacturer, or someone that manufactures food, or someone that grows food. So an industrial capitalist or an agriculturalist. Now, like, they produce a lot of food because of the technology. So they probably don't employ a lot of laborers like they used to. So they don't have like a massive control over the working class like they did back in the day. But like, what is the problem with that system is they own the means of production. So they control the means of producing food to profit off it, not to make food. And so like, that's an important distinction and a realization to make, that in this system, this mode of production that is capitalistic, people make food for profit, not because people need to eat food. And like, that is a massive problem in our society. Like we've discussed on this podcast, I'm pretty sure that like in 2020, America threw out $218 billion $218 billion worth of food. So they must have produced way more than that, but they still threw out $218 billion worth of food. And if you wanted to solve hunger in America, you can do that with about $20 billion. So like 10 times, you could, like, with the amount of food they threw out in 2020, you could solve hunger in America 10 times over. And so when you have a system where the people that own the means of production only have those means of production so they can make money off them, not to produce food that people need to survive, then you have a situation where you make some pretty shit calls in terms of efficiency, and you make some pretty shit calls in terms of distribution as well. And so like when someone says, see this as a means of production, it's not always about like, oh, this is producing a hierarchical society, and so that's a shit go. It's actually about democratizing the means of production. At the moment, we have people, usually a small number of people, that control something as important as food production. And so like they have the final say. So if the system is designed and it benefits them, let me just say that again, it benefits them to waste $218 billion a year. Usually the one argument that people have about capitalism being amazing is it's the most efficient. But like, if you're wasting stuff and it's still profitable, you have to ask yourself at some point along the line, is that actually the best way of doing it? Especially in the face of like the knowledge we have nowadays about like environmental destruction and like the way that we're like, exhausting basically the planet's resources and stuff like that. And like, the way that we also produce food and stuff like that through, industrial chemicals, is like, kind of poisoning us and causing us other problems. So are there more ethical ways to make food? And like, if profit comes first over ethical food production, maybe we're never going to solve some other problems when it comes to our health generally, because we're happy to have mass produced and fast food options as opposed to more healthy options. But like, if private interests control that for profit, you're never going to have that conversation properly. But like, if you seize the means of production, and this is the core element of seizing the means of production here. Now, in a Marxist sense, seizing the means of production would be all of the people that work in food production, so that work in those factories, work in any business that's associated with food production, and anyone that works on the farmland. like any of the farm hands, any of the people that are associated with dealing, like just working the land. And like sometimes that might be both. Capitalists might actually work the land too. They might actually work the land. So they're being productive. But like some capitalists just sit in a mansion somewhere and just like rake in the profits. They don't actually do anything. But like what seizing the means of production is actually about is the people that work it make the call. Not broader society. So not us, the broad masses, the voting populations out there, but the people that work it, they make the control. They control it and they make the decisions, and they do it democratically. One of the core values of our society at the moment is this love of democracy, because we think that it might not be as efficient all the time, but at least everybody gets a say or some type of representation in that system. So the idea of seizing the means of production is actually about bringing democracy to a place in society which it's been locked out of. It hasn't been locked out of our political systems. We vote. You could argue if we're really democratic or not. That's an argument for another day. But like, we vote in our political system, but we don't vote economically. That's all held by boards of directors and business owners. They run those things like a king or a monarch would have, or some type of autocrat or an authoritarian or a totalitarian. They have control over their entire system. And like, if they make poor business decisions and crash the economy, well, that was the risk that you get from a private institution. Now, I'm not saying that people that democratically run parts of the economy won't crash the businesses and stuff like that, but they'll be making democratic decisions. And if they make decisions, it might not just be about the profit. It might be about, hey, we have the knowledge of running this industry because we do the work. We know how it works. We could make this more efficient, or we could stop wasting $218 billion a year on this food over here. It might not be profitable, but who gives a shit? We're wasting all of this food. And so like seizing the means of production still leaves a lot of question marks. All right. It's not a solution to all of our problems.
Yeah.
It's not a solution to all of our problems, but it is supposed to take a very, I would say, heinous and potentially nefarious problem in our current system, which is one, it's done for private interests. And so if it's profitable for them to waste and allow people to die or allow people to suffer, and it's profitable, they'll do it. And like democratizing the economy, which is what seizing the means of production is about, is an option that I think we should potentially be exploring, if not just going straight for it. Because, we've had enough time in the sun with private ownership of the means of production under capitalism.
Let me just throw out a different idea that I've been tossing around, because I've been talking to my mate Peter, who's been describing to me the farming situation within Australia now. Basically, we've got like monopsonies, and the situation where like farmers are actually getting screwed on the price that they're selling their crops for, because they're having to sell to these big supermarket chains, and essentially, like in that situation, if you were talking about seizing the means of production, like at what point within, and this relates to what you were saying about the food wastage, like, I mean, there's an entire supply chain that goes on between how the means of production in my head, which is like the land itself, and working the land and the machinery and whatever, the labor, whatever else comes with that, and all the different stops that it goes through before the food actually makes it on my plate. Now, is that entire supply chain part of the means of production? Where do you seize it? Like, do you stop it at the supermarkets? Do you stop it at like how do you fix that problem? Because it doesn't feel like screwing the farmers. No, sorry to put it, but like taking over the farmers is really going to change anything if you're not changing the market dynamics that sort of goes along with it.
Yeah. Well, in a like in a socialist setting, and that's where seizing the means of production really comes in, it's every sector of the economy. So like what we described before, and this is why I thought it was apt to bring this up, is like food production now, like I really do mean it. Like you could service an entire population with a handful of people because we have such technology now. Like you basically could have machines doing most of the production. Like you could even automate it now. You can have drones like flying over, spraying pesticides over entire crop fields. And like, like you're scanning the area to figure out when the crops are ready to be picked. And then you have the machines, the croppers that actually go through and do all of that. That all used to be done by hand. And so like if, really it's just a bunch of families now that run the entire agricultural sector of the economy. And like they actually own the means of production and they're doing the work there, then that's pretty much seized already. But what you're talking about is that in Australia, we have it's not a unique situation, but in Australia, we have a specific situation where there's monopsony in the sense that there's like Coles and Woolworths. They pretty much are the merchant capitalists. So not industrial capitalists. They're not producing the value, but they're the middleman between the end consumer and the producer. And they are running the economy essentially because they decide which farmers live and die almost. And then they also decide which consumers can afford to be in that market too. Because like some people are like, fuck, I can't afford to shop at Woolworths. I'm going to go to Aldi. And so like they have incredible power because they own what you're talking about, the distribution of the produce and the relation between producer and consumer. And so like, let me put it to you though, there's a lot of people that work for Coles and Woolworths. And so like if they seized Coles and Woolworths and ran it democratically, as opposed to like some board of directors that sit in, I don't know, Sydney somewhere and like make the decisions for like basically the handling of all items of convenience across this entire nation, run by like, a board of directors and a bunch of shareholders somewhere in, I'm assuming Sydney, maybe they're in Melbourne or one of the central business districts. But like think about that. Like our entire economy in terms of just like the daily goods that we have to survive, most people will get it from one of those two chains. They might supplement it with local, shopping around locally, but like a good majority of people's like daily goods and like life essentials come from just Coles and Woolworths. And they're screwing people on both sides, which is what you're talking about. The same sentiment that you have for the farmers, you could have for the people that have to shop at Woolworths and Coles, right? Because they're constantly being screwed by like the price fixing that goes on. And they've been caught doing this between the two of them, Woolworths and Coles. So much for like free competition. They get in there and collude with each other and make sure when one puts up a price on something, the other one matches it like, incrementally and all that sort of stuff. So they definitely collude. And that's the problem with a monopsony. It acts like a monopoly in a sense because they can control entire markets for their own profit. They don't give a fuck about the farmers. They don't give a shit about the people. They're beholden, potentially, the board members, they're beholden to the shareholders and vice versa. They look after each other and scratch each other's backs. So like in that system, are you having the best and most efficient distribution of resources as a merchant capitalist middleman that is Coles and Woolworths? I would say no. I would say we could probably do that system better. And I would say as well, I would put it to you, if you put the people that work in Coles and Woolworths in charge of it, and they elected people to start making decisions from within those organizations, because again, they run them from the ground up. They're actually involved in the minutiae of that huge enterprise that covers the entire nation. I say let them decide what to do with it, how it should be run. And like if they decide to break it up, or something into smaller companies. Because that's what happens eventually when monopolies get too big, especially in America, they have antitrust laws and the government steps in and goes, no, monopoly is illegal, naughty. And like it is fucking illegal. But anyway, you have to have a state power that's strong enough to do that. But they come in, they break them up and then they institute competition back into the marketplace. And like that's what Australia is suffering from at the moment. The farmers are suffering and the consumer is suffering because there's not enough competition. And so you have two players that are basically screwing the system on, apparently on both ends, which is like quite the situation. And so like I am putting to you, Kareem, that like potentially seizing the means of production in this sense, and that's why I wanted to specify what it actually means, would be democratizing these institutions to be operated by the workers themselves, not by the general public, but by the workers.
I get the sentiment itself, but I suppose, I mean, looking at an organization like Coles or Woolworths, if you were to have a look at the variety of job functions that happens behind the scenes in terms of like the actual like running, like whether it comes to logistics, whether it talks to, you know, like the property management behind it, like the amount of different things that needs to go into the process of running an organization like Coles or Woolworths, like necessitates a specific skill set that may not necessarily be available to the people that are on the front lines. I mean, I'm sure, you know, look across the board, you know, you could probably find a way to compensate for it, but I just feel like there might actually be a need for a hierarchy in that sort of situation in terms of overseeing the management of.
But can I just say, like, in a democracy, like, I don't know how the federal government works. I really actually have no idea the actual mechanizations of running the country at the federal level. But I do vote for it. I'm democratically involved in that process. And so, like, all I'm saying to you,
at least get a vote in
all I'm saying is that they should have some participation in the organization of that association, that group of people that come together to do all the stuff that makes Woolworths and Coles turnover. They should be involved in the decision-making process. Now, whether they delegate to some representative, like the people that are involved in logistics, right? All the people that drive all the Woolworths trucks that produce, that send the goods all around the country, right? And this is why I said before, like if the workers get control of Woolworths and they're just like, holy shit, this thing is too big to organize. And they start carving it up, and they say, all right, you truck drivers, you go over there and we'll split the business up and you can be the Woolworths truck drivers company from now on. And you people are the fruit packers. You can be the fruit packers company from now on. And like you people that like pack the shelves, you can be your own company. And they all start to work together as a little, like, you know, ecosystem as opposed to one massive organization because it's too hard to control. That may be a result of democratizing that organization. Is splitting it up. Because at the moment, it's centralized. And it's centralized for the benefit of a bunch of board members and shareholders, I would say. For their profit. I'll say the word again.
Shareholders and
profit.
Not big on profit.
Mystery, say it again. I got tickles.
Yeah, I know, right? Say the thing, mystery. But like, look, let me just clarify this. The profit motive has gotten us to where we are.
Yeah, it's
an incredible force. But is it time to put the profit motive down? Like, you know, at one point in history, tying serfs to the land and owning the land and effectively owning serf was a really efficient way of managing society. It was really good for everyone. Peasants got a good deal out of it to a certain extent. And so, like, that was a really good way of organizing that society. And, like, for a while now, organizing stuff around profit has been incredibly productive. But, like, we are starting, like, you've pointed something out, talking to your friend about how farmers are getting screwed. Like, we are meeting large contradictions in this system now. And like that, I think that's actually the thing that people really have a problem with is like, look, they appreciate the system, but they can see there's a lot of fucking problems with it. And like those contradictions are really starting to mount in certain areas. And the question is, do we just say, oh, well, you know, this is the way it happens? Is it?
No, I'm not in favor of maintaining the system as as it is. I'm not sort of blindly sticking my head in the sand. I'm just wondering if there's something post-capitalism. If there's maybe a different way of doing things altogether that we haven't even thought about doing.
Well, let me throw a spanner in the works for you, because I've found something that I didn't even know recently. And I don't know, 4AS, if you were in those streams, but we've come across something called technocracy. And I never believed, Kareem, can I just say, ever before, that there was a third option. Let me just say to you now, as a revolutionary, I believe we may have found a third option. And I think we can leave that open for another podcast. But can I just say, mind absolutely blown that there may potentially be a different way of doing things outside of this.
I'd love to share some of the stuff that I've been working on as well.
Yes.
Just in terms of how AI, when I asked AI to redesign the system from the ground up, what it came up with, and I'd love to hear more about your options. So if we can end that for another podcast episode.
Well, look, it is called the Revolutionary Think Tank. I think it's most appropriate.
And you know what? Let's kind of bookend it there. So great discussion today, gents. And of course, the last segment of today being, what's that synthwave art? So who would like to have a crack at this one?
They look quite sleazy to me.
Yeah, they've burst into that place of business, and they're going to start seizing stuff. And they look very authoritarian too.
Yeah.
Is it about seizing?
Yeah, I see. The thing is, I literally just typed in seizing the means of the production and taking it from the capitalists, and it gave me that.
Yeah, nice.
But they haven't touched anything yet. I was hoping they'd start snatching shit.
You're not seizing it if you don't.
Start seizing something, damn it.
You know what my interpretation of this is that a whole bunch of workers have burst into the control room, and they're just death staring at the managers as they slowly back away, and then once they go out of the room, that's when they'll take the stuff.
That's so cool.
Okay, and with that, thank you everyone for tuning in, and please like, share, and subscribe. And remember to keep thinking and keep learning. And to sign us off, I'll give it to you, Mr. E.
Thank you very much, 4AS, and Kareem. Thank you for the discussion today.
Thank you for the education.
Well, that's good. It's great to flesh this stuff out. I love it. And to all of you out there, yes, like, share, subscribe. You know the drill. And until next time, please remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.